Hello everybody, and welcome back to a brand new video. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the Florida gubernatorial election and analyzing a poll that had incumbent Republican Governor Ron DeSantis down a point to Democratic challenger Charlie Crist. So we're going to get right into it here and just look at what this means and what I think is going to happen in this race, regardless of what this poll says. The top line of the poll is that Charlie Crist, the Democrat, is ahead of DeSantis, and that's not a good sign for DeSantis. Obviously, you never want to be down a point in a poll. You never want to be trailing, really. Like if you're running in a competitive race, there are bound to be polls you're losing in. There are bound to be polls you're winning in. But in a race that has been viewed as pretty solid for the Republican Party, like Florida governor, you would think that DeSantis would have at least a stable lead in most polls. But this is the second poll we've seen where DeSantis is down. There was an earlier one where he was down, I think, by a point as well to Charlie Crist. And it was an absolute, I think, disaster of a poll where he was down like double digits that I don't think anyone on earth took that poll seriously. But, this poll, I think a lot of people are going to disagree with, but it is still a poll that isn't, it's not what you'd expect, but it's not horrifically unreasonable the way the poll that had him down by I think 15% or whatever, because DeSantis is very likely to win, but if you lose, it'll certainly be by a point. So the fact that Charlie Crist is ahead in this poll is good for Charlie Crist, but at the same time, you really want to be looking at this poll from an objective angle. And so I think that when you talk about a poll like this that has Ron DeSantis down by one, it's important to take it with a grain of salt, but it's also important to keep that grain of salt with you, because realistically, DeSantis is going to win re-election. This does not change my view that DeSantis is going to win. It does not change my view that he's at least favored. But it does, show that there is a path for Charlie Crist, albeit a very narrow one. And I think it's worth noting that this poll, is a decent poll for Jolie. They're not verified. I think Nate Silver gives them, I think a C or D grades. They're not the best pollster, but they're also not a disaster the way like Trafalgar or St. Pete's polls or, some Quinnipiac polls. So I think that this poll isn't awful, but it's important to remember that there are better polls, and that I think, if you were to get a better poll, they would probably put DeSantis as a lead, because I think DeSantis is actually leading here. So Fabrizio Lee, I guess for some background on them, they're a GOP internal poll. They actually, I think, worked for Trump during his presidency to see, the issues and stuff. And they were not really super acclaimed. They weren't, they weren't a very sought after poll, to get in your race. It's obviously, polling is good. It's interesting to see the polls. It's interesting to look at them, but they weren't like the most well known or the best poll. But it's worth noting that DeSantis is down a point in a GOP internal poll, because usually internal polls for a party are more favorable to them. Usually internal poll for the Republican Party is going to be showing a better number for the Republicans than a normal poll or an internal poll for the Democratic Party. So DeSantis being down by a point in a poll that has worked for his party is very, very bad for him. Although again, it's only one poll, and if you actually take a look at what we're seeing right now in general with all Florida governor polls, these other polls have shown DeSantis, in leads in most of them, and they're actually pretty spread out. Like we saw, going back to February, we saw polls that had DeSantis up by 21, 23, 16, 11, 8, 11, and he's ahead in most polling, because again, DeSantis is viewed as a pretty popular governor. He's viewed as someone who's going to win re-election, and I think that when you get a poll that has DeSantis winning, it kind of corroborates that belief. It validates the Florida is a Republican state narrative. And so the recent polls, going back to March, had DeSantis up by 24, 16, 19. And then there's this one poll where he was ahead by 1 point over Charlie Crist. This is a Phillips Academy poll. This is a high school, actually. And it was conducted last month, and it's interesting. I mean, I'm glad that high schools are polling, because I think it's important for, obviously, young people like myself to get exposure to politics and get exposure to how elections work. And so I think that a poll sponsored by a high school is cool, but at the same time, when you are looking at this result where you have DeSantis up by 1, and it's you have so many undecideds, and you have just so many just so many small sample size, so many things that could go wrong. I think this poll isn't great, And again, not all, like the poll I was talking about earlier that didn't even add up to 100%. That was just had Crist up by 13. That poll was a complete joke. And then this poll that had Nikki Fried up by a point, there were no undecideds, and it's at this point it was 9 months to go till the election. So most of the polls that have wacky results, like the Democrats winning in Florida, are totally just not good polls. They have numbers that just don't make sense. They just don't pass the basic smell test. Like obviously it's good to be objective, but I think there are subjective things you can do that can become objective. So for example, if a poll comes out and you're like, this makes no sense, I think that our brains can exert that veto power. If I see a poll that has, I don't know, like the Democrats winning the Wisconsin Senate race by 14%, that to me does not pass the smell test. That is like, I don't care how good the crosstabs are, that is not correct. It just doesn't conform to basic logic when it comes to talking about these elections. And so when I see a poll that has the Democrats winning in Florida, I am just not a big fan of it. I don't even need to look at the crosstabs because DeSantis isn't going to lose. It's really that simple, guys. Like, I know, some of you might have clicked this video expecting to hear me talk about how DeSantis is losing or how Crist can win this race and, how there's a path. And yeah, there's a path for him, I guess. Like, I could make a map where Charlie Crist wins by like a small amount, but it's a very unlikely path. It's like saying, can the Democrats, well, that wouldn't be a good example, but it's like, Charlie Crist winning in Florida is kind of the equivalent of the Republicans winning in, I don't know, like Oregon in 2020. Like, it exists. I mean, well, yeah, it's kind of a similar thing in that the Democrats probably have a 5% chance of winning Florida. Trump had like a 1% chance of winning Oregon. And so the path certainly exists. Like, you can make a map where it goes your way. You can shuffle counties around and you can put percentages in. You can say, this is, this could happen, this could happen, this could happen. And, this would give the Democrats a 0.1% victory in Florida. You can do that. But it's just not how. I don't expect the Democrats to be winning Florida for the same reason that I don't think that I am about to get crushed by a falling walrus from the sky. It's just not likely. It's a strange comparison. It's nonsensical in many ways. I understand it doesn't conform to, I guess, the comparison we're doing here, but it just, the Democrats winning Florida in a midterm in which the national environment will be more Republican than 2020. Biden is president. The economy is not looking too hot right now. And the Democrats are down nationwide to Republicans. They're not going to win Florida if they couldn't have won in 2020. Like, go to 2018. 2018 was a blue wave year. The Democrats flipped governorships in Nevada, New Mexico, Kansas, Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, Maine. They didn't win Florida. Ron DeSantis was down in virtually every poll in Florida. Like, if you go back to 2018, look at the polling, you would have thought this race was lean Democratic. Trafalgar obviously had DeSantis up because it's Trafalgar. It's a Republican poll. But every other poll leading up to that, this poll had DeSantis up. But every other poll had the Democrats, had Andrew Gillum, who was DeSantis' challenger in 2018. Every other poll had him winning. And if you look here, he lost by 0.4%. It was a close race. But if the Democrats couldn't have won this race in 2018, they are not going to be winning it again. In 2020, Biden lost it by 3.3%. If they couldn't have won it, if they got, Biden kind of got his teeth kicked out in Florida in 2020. It was a bad showing for him in the state. And if Biden underperformed in Florida by that much in 2020, it's going to be even worse for Democrats in 2022. I just have a hard time seeing the Democratic Party winning this race. So, you'll see polls like this. You will see many more of these to come. There'll be probably even more polls that have Charlie Crist beating Ron DeSantis. And Crist isn't a terrible candidate for the Democrats. I think he might do some good things, but DeSantis is going to win re-election. You can stop believing polls that literally cannot be true. Just use your brain, guys. Look at this from an objective angle. Make sure they pass the smell test and then move on with your lives. This poll is going to go straight in the garbage for me.